Hey there. I wanted to share with you a piece of technology that I've really come to enjoy working with. And that piece of technology is this library or I guess library or tool called Testcontainers. And in this case, I'm going to show you how I use it specifically in a .NET Web API to make integration testing better. But you can use it for a lot of different things, and then basically a bunch of different languages. They have docs for Node.js, for Python, for Rust, for Go. So really, regardless of whatever language you prefer to write code in, you can probably find a use case for test containers in the applications that you're building. But I want to show you a very common use case for it in the applications that I built, and specifically in a web API. So let's go ahead and just kind of lay the groundwork, kind of set the stage, if you will. So all I have here is a very simple tasks API. All it does is right now all it does is it fetches tasks by ID from a database and then returns that to the user. And it specifically talks to MongoDB. So all I'm doing up here at the top is I'm building that MongoDB context, which is a class I've defined down below. And that MongoDB context implements a particular interface. And that interface is primarily there right now so that I can do things like integration testing, but mock out the context so that I don't have to worry about actually talking to a real database in my integration test, which I'll show you in a second. But this is kind of painful, and you'll see that when we take a look at my test. But again, it's a web API, very simple. It just assumes that there's already data in some database, and you give it an ID for a task or a to-do, and it returns that back to you. However, if we look at my tests, you'll see my tests are kind of painful. So a couple videos ago, I showed you how I do integration testing with web APIs using a particular NuGet package called Microsoft ASP.NET Core.mvc.testing that allows you to spin up basically an instance of your API in memory and then make requests against it. And then you can do all sorts of things like changing the configuration, stubbing out particular services, or different class registrations that you've registered in your dependency injection container. And so what I'm doing here in my integration test is, well, because my integration test right now can't talk to an actual MongoDB instance, what I'm doing is I have a mock context using a library called mock, which is a very popular mocking library in the .NET world. And all I'm doing is I'm registering that mock context as my MongoDB context instead of a concrete actual instance of MongoDB context that actually talks to a real database. And then down here in my test class, I'm actually using that mock context here. I'm capturing it in a private field, and then I'm doing all this boilerplate setup prior to making my API request, so that in my API controller, my handler, I actually do return a task when I hit that endpoint. So if I run this, you'll see it passes. So let's go ahead and run this test. And you'll see it's going to start running here in just a second. We should see a little indicator pop up here on the top left next to the method. There we go. So it's running. You can see it's running right there. And hopefully it should pass. Otherwise, yep. And there you go. So it passed. And again, this is kind of a nasty little integration test because I'm having to do all this setup to make sure that in my controller handler, or my handler method for that particular controller route, I'm actually getting a task back from my context so that I can assert, hey, when a task does get returned, I return the right response, or if the task doesn't get returned, I don't return the right response. But this is kind of messy and somewhat brittle to be mocking out this this MongoDB context. It would be really nice if I could just talk straight to a MongoDB instance. And so this is where Testcontainers comes in, right? So what I can do with Testcontainers is instead of, I could basically get rid of this interface. I don't really need this interface if I'm never going to actually mock out the context, if I'm actually always going to use an actual MongoDB context that has the ability to talk to an actual MongoDB instance, I don't really need this interface. But what I can do with test containers is I can spin one of these MongoDB instances up in memory, grab the connection string, pass that to my MongoDB context, and actually use a real database. So let me show you how that works. So let's go ahead and exit out of my project here really quick. And then let's cd into my test project. And then let's go back to the test containers documentation and let's actually add the NuGet package for test containers. So let's add test containers. And this is the package that's going to allow me to do all the programmatic instantiation and building and running and stopping of containers from my code, right? So let's go ahead and now go back to my project here. And where we want to start is basically we want to start back in that test class, and we just want to start refactoring this so that instead of using this mock context here, right, instead of using this guy, this way we can actually just provide a connection string to my application here. We can actually use my existing configuration value or key and give it a proper connection string value, and then I don't even need to register this mock context anymore. That just doesn't become necessary. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's remove this. So we don't need that anymore. But now we actually need an actual connection string, right? So this is where we need to actually be able to pass an actual connection string to my application that's running in memory. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of this context, and instead what we're going to do is we are going to have a container. And this is going to be a MongoDB container. But I'm realizing as I'm writing this that I do need one other package to make this work. So let me write this out real quick. And so each thing you want to use with test containers may or may not require you to add a separate package. I could actually do this all with just using their container builder, right? So I could actually specify I want the MongoDB image, but there's actually a MongoDB package that I can add that makes this much easier. So let's go over here and let's grab that. .NET add test containers MongoDB. So we'll go back into my test project here. We'll add this guy. Okay, now what we should be able to do is go back to my test class where we were, and let's begin that refactoring again. Okay, so we got our MongoDB container, and that's going to be set to a new, let's see, MongoDB container. So this is going to be equal to a new MongoDB builder. And then here we're going to specify the image. So we want with image, and we'll do the latest version of Mongo. And then we don't need to specify the default port. We'll just use the default port. Then we need to bring in some usings. That we can get rid of some of our usings. Okay, now that we have this MongoDB container and we have it built, we need to actually be able to start, stop, and dispose of that container as part of our app factory, as part of the life cycle of our app factory. So in order to do this, we're going to add we're going to implement a particular interface from XUnit. And I am using an XUnit test project here. So if you prefer InUnit or MS Test or something of that shape or that form, I'm guessing they have a similar functionality to this. But for XUnit, this is how we're going to do it. So we're going to say async lifetime. And then we're going to implement this method. And so we're going to need to implement a initialization method and a dispose method. So we'll go ahead and say we need to implement the public async task initialize async like this. And then we also need to implement the public dispose method. So we're going to say public new async task dispose async, and then we want to do two things here. We want to say await underscore MongoDB container not dispose, but first we want to stop it, Then we want to dispose of it. We don't need to call the base. We can just say MongoDB container dispose async, just like that. Now what we should be able to do is inside our configure web host is we can actually grab that connection string from the MongoDB container. And now, just like we would read in our MongoDB container connection string from configuration, what I'm doing in my test is I'm passing the connection string from the container I started using test containers as the configuration value. Okay, now in my test, I need to make some modifications here. So instead of doing all this mocking, I just need to get a real context from my factory and then use that to do the setup in my test. So in this case, we're going to go private read only, and we're just going to say I MongoDB context. And instead of using a mock, we're going to say factory dot services, and Copilot's right. We're going to say get required service, and we need to bring in a using for that. And then down here where we're doing all this mock setup, we can get rid of this now, which makes our test so much simpler to write. We can just say, instead of doing this, let's actually just insert a task, just like this. So we'll say Mongo context, and it's going to be task not to do. Right? And so how much simpler is that, right? And now we're actually going to have an actual running instance of MongoDB that our integration tests can talk to. So let's go ahead and run this and make sure that it passes. It should still pass. So we'll say leader tr. And it may take a second longer than the mocked out version because we are actually starting a container, but it's actually pretty speedy. And that's running. And it's still running. And there we go, and it passed. And so just so you can believe me, you don't think that I'm a liar, hey, that there's an actual container running, let's go ahead and pull up Docker Desktop. And let's go ahead and see this in action. So what we'll do is we'll run our tests, and then we'll switch over to Docker. And when we run our tests and switch over to Docker, in Docker you should see a test containers stack, and that will have a MongoDB instance running. So let's go ahead and do leader tr. We'll switch over to Docker, and now you should see a test container is going to pop up here. There it is. All right, there's our test container. It's actually running a MongoDB service for us that our test can talk to, and then our test pass again. So this is a really simple example of how you can use it, but you can kind of see the power in this, in that now your integration tests have access to your DB context. You can add data there, remove data there, clean data up in there, but now you don't have to do any kind of mocking out of that data layer. You can actually talk all the way from the entry point of your application all the way down to the database, and have more confidence in what your integration tests are reporting to you, that your app actually does what you think your app's going to do, and it makes writing your tests way more enjoyable. None of that all that boilerplate setup to just return a mocked out task or to do in this case. I can just pass that in as my connection string, and I'm off to the races. And let's clean up my usings here, because that bothers me. And then real quick, before we go, I'll just switch back over to the test containers documentation. And like I said, there's a ton of use cases for this. You can see they have a ton of different pre-existing built modules, but you don't need the modules. You can just use, their container builder out of the box. They have really great documentation for a bunch of different languages. So yeah, if you haven't used test containers yet, you should go check it out. This is how I've been putting it to use most recently. I really enjoy it. It's kind of become a mainstay for me when it comes to building applications and setting up automated tests. So yeah, if you found this helpful, if you enjoy test containers too, leave a comment. Otherwise, I will see you guys in another video, another short, or another live stream. So, all right, guys, I'll talk to you later.